I was lucky in a sense that I was brought up in a politically sophisticated family. My parents had been active in anti-communist left-wing politics. So that I knew, unlike the other kids, I knew both what was wrong with communism and what was wrong with the kind of anti-communism that ruled and reigned, and that really this sort of mindless anti-communism that assumed that any kind of helping of the poor, for example, was communism, that was communism's best friend. In my school,
in your school?
I remember in my school, all of a sudden, a film called Operation Abolition was being shown. Not in social studies class, not in assembly, but in gym class, because there was a sort of a John Birch Society gym teacher. And here was this film being screened over and over again. And it was a documentary, an alleged documentary, actually produced by the government, produced by the House Un-American Activities Committee, a propaganda documentary against efforts to abolish the House Un-American Activities Committee. And among other things, this was the first glimpse I had of student protest. I mean, they actually showed protesters at Berkeley being hosed by fire hoses and being arrested. And then, of course, I and my friends would watch this film and say, "Hey, that looks pretty good." You know? I remember driving with my mother in a car in 1952, a little kid, and I said, "Mom, is there anybody in the world that you wish would die?" A heavy question for a 9-year-old. And she said, "Yes, Joseph Stalin and Joseph McCarthy." And so I thought this was a weighty business. And I did know a lot about it's simply not true that liberals did not appreciate the threat of communism or the oppressiveness of communism. In fact, liberals led the fight against communism, and they were simply McCarthyism and this kind of right-wing so-called anti-communism was, I think, a knowing distortion of where liberals actually stood. McCarthy was an evil figure, among other reasons, because he was not a real anti-communist. I mean, to be an anti-communist, the way I learned about anti-communism, meant to be against oppression in all its forms. It meant to be in favor of freedom, and especially freedom of speech and freedom of expression in all its forms. And what McCarthyism said was, no, you can't express this opinion. You can't express some freedom of speech. Doesn't include this speech over here. And that, to me, I couldn't understand why everyone couldn't see that was essentially the same as communism. I remember when if I would say something critical about American society in school, you know, sometimes the other kids would say, "Hey, why don't you go back to Russia? If you don't like it, go back to Russia." And they just seemed perfectly ridiculous. I mean, I remember a Herblock cartoon that summed it up for me. It showed Barry Goldwater pointing his finger angrily at a poor mother and child sitting on a stoop and saying to her, "If you had any gumption, you'd go out and inherit a department store." Because Goldwater was a department store heir, and he was always talking about how we have to have individual initiative and get out there, and it just seemed so transparently absurd, the conservative movement and Goldwater, and it was resisting not only it seemed to be resisting not only what was right but what was inevitable. We forget now, I think, that Goldwater and his movement was against the civil rights laws, was against the voting rights laws, was essentially against the full citizenship of black people. I'm not saying they were racist. I'm sure that they were sincere in their views about states' rights or whatever it was. But we were impatient with it, and we just thought, this is ludicrous.